Ohio Senator J.D. Vance tweeted out yesterday, the endowments at Penn, Harvard, and MIT have a combined $95 billion plus in assets, yet only pay a 1.4% tax rate on net investment income. Then they use these funds to push DEI and woke insanity. He then went to the Senate floor to offer some speechifying in advance of his legislation that would tax the largest college endowments 35%.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to speak to a particular problem in America's higher education system, a problem born of unfairness and of mass subsidy from the American taxpayer that is now metastasized into one of the most corrupt and one of the most politically active and politically hostile organizations in the United States of America, and that is elite colleges. A lot of us have watched, not just since the October 7th attacks on Israel, but for over a decade, as America's colleges seem less and less interested in education and more interested in teaching things like racial hatred and various forms of far-left ideology. And a lot of us have asked ourselves, how is this possible? How is it that universities that should be responsive to the public will, responsive to their donors and alumni, responsive to their students, how is it that they can go so far, so fast without any pushback? And the answer, my fellow Americans, Mr. President, is university endowments, which have grown incredibly large on the backs of subsidies from the taxpayers, and they have made these universities completely independent of any political, financial, or other pressure, and that is why the university system in this country has gone so insane. At just 3 universities, Mr. President, Harvard, MIT, and Penn, the endowments are approaching $100 billion. That is as large as some of the largest hedge funds in America. In fact, Harvard, Penn, Yale, many of our Ivy League institutions and others beyond that are little more than hedge funds with universities attached to them as pretend. This must stop. It must stop because it has enabled political insanity. It must stop because it has burdened an entire generation of Americans with over $1 trillion of student debt. Student debt relief that many of my friends on the other side would like plumbers in Ohio to pay for, but I think if the universities caused the problem, Mr. President, they ought to pay for it. And if they paid for it, if they didn't have these massive endowments subsidized by taxpayers, then maybe they would be a little bit more responsive to the public will in the process. I have advanced legislation that would do something very simple. Take the hundreds of billions of dollars in large university endowments, not even all university endowments, just the largest university endowments, and apply a tax to them.
Is this a good idea, or is this dangerous precedent setting for the purposes of being punitive against bad actors in places like the Ivy League, the West Coast, my alma mater, Northwestern? You know, don't forget, J.D. Vance is a Yale man.
Oh, yeah.
Yale and Yale Law School, too, and so is our next guest. Roger Kimball went to Yale. He's also the editor of the new Criterion. Roger, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, my pleasure.
So what do you think about Senator Vance's idea? And also, too, I mean, I need to see the details, but the idea of taxing only large endowments and not smaller endowments and what those cutoffs would be, I mean, that could be problematic. But anyway, the gist of the idea, you know, sort of the principle behind it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, judgment is always called for in these situations, and you have to exercise a little good judgment. But I mean, the fact is that as JD said, the size of these endowments renders these institutions essentially unaccountable. They're, you know, they're not responsible to anyone except their own self-engorging, progressive left-wing greed. So, you know, Peter Thiel some years ago had the idea of, you know, you pick the number, $1 billion, $2 billion, whatever. You pick some number, or maybe it should be calibrated some relation between the student body, size of the student body, and the size of the endowment, and anything over that number, there would be required to, Peter's idea was 10% a year to some other charitable organization. So Harvard's always going on and on about DEI and, how concerned they are with the underclass and so on. So why don't they take 10% of their $50 billion endowment and give it to, say, Howard University? Of course, they wouldn't do that voluntarily, but something like that would be a very good idea. I think that you in our society, you want these institutions to be part of the democratic process, which means accountable. And the same thing, by the way, is true of all of this alphabet soup of government, quasi-government agencies that basically runs our lives. Not Congress.
Well, to that. Sorry to interrupt, but to that point, would it be a more palatable and more on point proposal to say, instead of proposing a tax on the endowments and getting into the business of taxing charitable contributions and charitable and nonprofit organizations, we're going to get the federal government out about, he mentioned subsidizing. We'll get the federal government out of the subsidizing business rather than subsidizing than taxing. Get the federal government out of the student loan business altogether.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. The government should not be. The first thing that should happen is the Department of Education should be abolished, along with about 30 or 40 other government agencies, and probably the 16th Amendment should be rescinded. That's the one that made the income tax legal. But these are bold proposals. But after all, we're supposed to be a young experimental country. Why don't we do something young and experimental for a change, rather than be part of this leviathan of yesterday's thinking. I admire JD. I think he's great, and the idea of imposing a tax on the universities will send a frisson down the spines of the presidents at those universities. But probably at the end of the day, what we want to do is think of a way of making the universities do what they're supposed to do. Why do we make them tax exempt? Why do we give them all of these societal privileges? The professors are treated with great respect and so on. Why is that? Well, because we thought that these educational institutions were there. They exist to preserve and transmit the highest values of our civilization. But what if they don't do that anymore? What if, like so many institutions in our country, they instead of doing what they were originally intended to do, they do the opposite. And they now, instead of being dedicated to preserving and transmitting the highest values of our civilization, they're dedicated to tearing them down, to deconstructing them, to undermining the values of Western civilization by this insane menu of so-called progressive causes, everything from DEI to the whole transsexual thing. And this recent example of people asking the presidents of these most elite universities, well, would it contravene the rules at Harvard to call for the genocide of Jews? I mean, as Elise Stefanik said, this is an easy question to answer, right? But these moral pygmies who are running these institutions are just kind of they're just kind of caught up in this net of progressive insanity, and they can't answer these simple questions.
They're not the only ones. Going to the Republican side of the aisle, the passage of the National Defense Authorization supplemental funding with a extension of Section 702 of FISA for 4 months, warrantless searches, and also, basically kicking the can on any restrictions on the armed services with respect to abortion provision or provision of services for gender identity surgeries and care and the like.
Right.
So, I mean, it speaks to sort of what a lot of us were saying when Kevin McCarthy was deposed. You don't have an appreciation for the caucus he's dealing with, but it also speaks to what our expectation should be, I guess, about Mike Johnson's leadership as Speaker, given the composition of the caucus.
Yeah. Well, frankly, the Republicans are only a little bit better than the Democrats. I mean, there's some great people in Congress, but as a whole, they are all supping at the same trough. What we have done is create an agenda of dependency, and there's a great deal of incentive to keep things going. The question is, of course, how long can it go on? We have a $33 trillion federal debt. I mean, it's an eye-watering sum of money. Can it go on forever? Probably not. The economist Herb Stein once said that what can't go on forever won't. The question is, how is this going to unwind? Can we grow our way out of it? Some people think so. I don't know. It's a lot of money, and it's not just the debt. It's the kind of moral fiber behind it. I mean, the most basic distinctions seem to have been lost. I mean, we used to be able to say, okay, this person is male and this person is female. We can't even do that anymore. And once you kind of lose that basic, sense of a basic moral compass, everything is lost. And at Harvard, if you misgender someone, if somebody says, "Oh, although I'm actually really a male, I want you to treat me as a female." If you misgender that person, you can be expelled. But it's okay to call for the obliteration of an entire religion. It's insane.
All right, Roger Kimball, we are almost 48 hours since Hunter Biden gave the middle finger to Congress. Why hasn't he been arrested yet for contempt of Congress?
Well, there's his subpoena. I mean, there are different kinds of subpoenas, as it were. I mean, he was not really obligated to show up before Congress, I believe, but he might be eventually. And he's a protected class. He's like the spotted owl or something. Why? Because he's the president's son. The people who think he's going to go to jail, that's insane. Unless what I actually believe is going on in the background is I think that the people who actually run the country are getting very nervous because it's been borne in upon them that Joe Biden cannot win the next election. And I would not be at all surprised to learn that the people who are actually pulling the strings are subtly or not so subtly suggesting to Joe that you find a way to back out, and we'll make sure these charges go away against your son.
Well,
that's what I think is going on.
Well, interesting thing there. Well, and I mean, by the way, I respectfully disagree with you that he wasn't compelled to show up. He was compelled to show up. That whole thing that Abby Lowell was saying, his defense attorney, the formal impeachment inquiry vote was necessary. No, it was not. The subpoena was issued by both House Oversight and Judiciary Committee. They have independent subpoena issuing authority. He was compelled to show up. He should be held in contempt of Congress. And Jonathan Turley over at George Washington Law School makes the additional point that there was this talk that Biden, the big guy Biden, was aware that a number one son was going to do this press conference, and so that potentially triggers an obstruction of justice claim against the big guy in an impeachment proceeding, depending on the exact nature of that conversation. So Hunter really put the big guy in a more of a bind, not less of one.
Turley says that he had to go, then he had to go. He's almost always right. I've read elsewhere that that there was some ambiguity about it, but I'm happy to stand corrected on that. I mean, I would love to see him held to account. Do I think it's going to happen? Probably not, unless they're using this as a lever to to get the big guy to step down. But of course, that's a problem too, because what if Joe Biden goes, then who becomes president? Are we going to accept Kamala Harris as president? I don't think so.
Roger Kimball, editor of the New Criterion. Roger, thanks as always. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank
guys.
you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560.
Merry Christmas, you filthy animal.
The Answer.
If you're self-employed and purchase